Open your Bibles to Genesis 20. We continue our walk through Abraham's friendship with God. And this morning we're going to be in Genesis chapter 20, and we'll walk through the entirety of that chapter, all 18 verses of Genesis chapter 20. My wife Jennifer has one rule for our marriage and family that is above all other rules, and that rule is do not do anything dumb enough to get yourself on the news. It is inevitable that I will do dumb things, but my dumb actions are never to be so dumb that they are newsworthy. Now, for the illustration that I kind of wanted to use, if I gave any details about the illustration, Jen would need to kill me when the service was over when we got home. And since she doesn't want to be on the news, which of course would be my fault for using an unapproved illustration, can't really use it this morning. But the nature of marriage and really the reality of any relationship, whether it's in the office or between a parent and a child, is that those things that we argue and fight about, whether it's the things that we're arguing and fighting about in the first year of our marriage, those are typically the same things we're arguing about 20 years later. The arguments that Jen and I had during our first year of marriage, 15 years later, I am still doing those same dumb things that same result in the same hurt feelings and then end up having the same gentle disagreements over all of those years later from my selfish behavior. If a girlfriend is annoyed that her boyfriend spends too much time playing video games, there's a good chance she's going to be complaining to her friends when she has 2 kids that her husband is spending all of his time playing Call of Duty and not helping with the kids. I can look at my own kids and see the ways that they rebel and disobey today isn't all that different from how they obeyed as toddlers. One sad reality of friendship is that most people aren't very good at change. So I'm sticking my foot in my mouth in the year 2022 in very similar ways that I did back in 2007. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You could probably also say you can't teach a young husband new tricks either. As Abraham grows in his friendship with God, we're going to learn that even in those places where we fail to mature and change, God does not fail to be faithful. God is one who understands the reality of friendship. And that is when you love someone, you need to be willing to forgive them over and over and over again, very often for the same thing over and over again. God does not operate in this magical fairy tale world where He instantly expects us to be mature tomorrow and never get tripped up by the same old sins, even when we've had 25 years to get those behaviors out of our lives. God loves us because He is loving, and not because we have earned His love through personal change. This morning, Abraham is going to fall into an old sin. But since God is a good friend, even though Abraham doubts Him, even though Abraham puts their covenant in jeopardy, the Lord will not fail Abraham because God understands the reality of friendship. And let's see how this works starting in verses 1 and 2 of our passage this morning. And Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She's my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. We read here that Abraham travels into the kingdom of Gerar, a kingdom that is ruled by Abimelech. So first thing I want to get out of the way is Abimelech should be seen as a title and not a name, kind of like Pharaoh in Egypt is the title of their king. And Gerar is the kingdom that existed in the land that would end up being the kingdom of Philistia, the land of the Philistines. But at this point in history, the Philistines had not traveled to that land and taken over that part of the promised land. So we have Abraham. He's still technically in the land that was promised to him, but for reasons we aren't told, decides to move into an area that at this time period is ruled by a king called Abimelech, and his kingdom is known as Gerar. And when Abraham goes into Gerar, he falls back into old habits. He falls back into the sins of fear and deceit. Abraham is afraid of the men of Gerar. As Robert Alter wrote, he is making the mistake of painting all of his neighbors with the same brush as Sodom. But we need to understand that not every person outside of the family of Abraham is a sodomite. And in his fear that is based on faulty assumptions, he decides he needs to lie about his relationship with Sarah again. Now, this has led many people to say, oh, Genesis 20 is just a repeat of that same story in Genesis chapter 12 when Abraham lied when he went down to the land of Egypt. This is the same thing. It's a repeat when Isaac will end up doing this decades later. I want us to consider just for a moment Abraham's cultural context. And I think that context might allow us to appreciate this story without merely dismissing it as a mere duplicate. Abraham lived in a world where one of the most common ways to increase your food stores for the winter was to get a bunch of guys together, attack a nearby village, and steal their food so that you can add it to your food for the upcoming season. He lived in a world where if you needed a little bit more help around your house, maybe you wanted a second wife, maybe you had a son who was neglected and no women wanted to marry him, very often to get another woman into your household, you would prey upon an unsuspecting traveler, kidnap one or more women in their group, and enslave them and make them your own. That was the world that Abraham lived in. I think this tactic about lying about the real relationship with your wife out of fear of a nearby warlord, this was something that I do not think was in any way uncommon in that time period. I believe that many cowardly men lost their wives because they lied and said, she's not my wife, and maybe even exchanged a small dowry in giving their wife up to someone who was more powerful or wealthy. So I think we need to see here, Abraham is not doing something really weird, but he's just acting like the locals. And that is when you travel into a land that is controlled by an unopposed sovereign, you need to be wary because he might just take your wife as his own. So Abraham here is just acting like your average coward, your everyday liar, just like he was back in Egypt all those years ago. And you know what? Here's the great thing about our God. God understands Abraham's weaknesses. That is not to say God is okay with Abraham's weaknesses. God is not approving of Abraham's fears, but God understands nonetheless and provides mercy when judgment is all that a less merciful person would have given. Because what is one thing we should all be willing to do for our friends? We give our friends grace and mercy in their struggles. We come to them with compassion and support in their hour of need. This is a sign of friendship. 2 weeks ago, as Craig was mentioning earlier, not mentioning me by name, but Craig and I did a 21-mile run, which was the longest run I had ever done in my life. And of course, since I was doing a longest run ever with Craig, it's going to end up being a sermon illustration. So Craig and I were doing our 21-mile run, and I felt great at the beginning of that run. After 10 miles, feeling wonderful. After 16 miles, not that great, but at the same time, not that bad either. But then as we hit 19 miles, oh man, all of a sudden I could not see straight. Both of my legs were cramping up. There were 3 times over that last 2 miles that I just collapsed on the sidewalk. I walked more than I ran, and during those last 2 miles, I kept saying the same thing to Craig over and over again. I kept saying, Craig, I'm sorry. Craig, I'm sorry I can't go faster. Craig, I'm sorry you need to run ahead of me and get ice and water. Craig, I'm so sorry that I can't do this better. And in my weakness, there was no point where Craig looked down on me on the sidewalk and said, you are such a weak loser. This is just 20 miles. I've run 100 miles before. Get up and run to the end. No, he was a friend, so he gave me mercy when I was weak. In this story, God sees Abraham's weakness. And instead of casting him aside, instead of looking for someone else to make a covenant with, and we need to remember at this point in the story, Isaac is going to be born in the very next chapter. Abraham is at the last mile of a marathon journey to the birth of his son. Sarah was going to be pregnant any day. All he needed to do was keep her close for a few more weeks. But when Abraham was too weak to keep the faith, like a friend, God came in mercy. And that's exactly what we see in verses 3 through 8. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she even herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech arose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. While Genesis chapter 12 made it clear that Sarah became a part of Pharaoh's harem, and it words as if it was everything that would entail, here in Genesis chapter 20, God makes it clear that Abimelech never had an opportunity to so much as touch Sarah, let alone lie with her. God immediately steps in to protect the integrity of Abimelech from the consequences of the sin and the deception of Abraham and Sarah. And the first thing that we must see in this narrative is God's response to our sins and our failures is to protect us. It is not to throw us to the wolves. It is not to make sure that we endure every pain and consequence of sin possible. But God's first movement when we stumble and fall into sin is to protect those who are His own. Now, this doesn't mean that we will not face painful consequences due to our sin. Abraham has faced painful consequences in the past due to his sin, and he will even be mocked and shamed in this own chapter thanks to his lies. But what it means is that even in the midst of Abraham facing the consequences of his sin, the Lord will still provide grace and protection for his friends. Here in our church, I've talked about the subject of boundaries before, boundaries in our friendships, boundaries in our relationships here in church. And boundaries is all about walking that line where you are protecting and providing mercy to someone while at the same time allowing them to reap what they sow and experience consequences from their sin. And what I think we see in this story is that God always walks those boundary lines to perfection, where He protects His friends. He watches over us. He provides mercy to us while also at the same time allowing us to face the sting of our sin. But God not only protects Abraham here in this story by preventing Abimelech from lying with his wife, but also notice what God also says about Abraham in verse 7. The Lord said, "Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet." This is the first record in all of the Bible of someone being called a prophet of God. And when does it occur? When is Abraham named the prophet of God? It is in the midst of Abraham's failure and sin. A prophet is one who speaks for God. It is one who bestows God's blessings or God's cursings upon others. And even in the middle of this story, when Abraham could better be called God's embarrassment than God's prophet, the Lord still sees Abraham as a prophet, which shows us that even when we struggle with sin in our lives, God in no way sees us as less or beneath one who is called as His own people. You see, it's not that God looks down on us in love when we're walking in righteousness, but then once we fall back into those old sin habits, God doesn't then say, "Oh, look at Kenny, that liar. I don't even know who he is." Or look at John, that greedy guy drowning in debt. Never heard of him before. Or look at Mandy, that self-righteous sinner. Who does she think she is? She's not even mine. That's not how God works. Instead, when we fall into sin, He is gracious and slow to anger. He protects His children. Just think about how God interacted with the children of Israel during their wilderness wanderings in the desert. When out of fear, Israel refused to obey the Lord. They refused to enter the promised land, and they experienced painful consequences to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But what happened in the midst of that wilderness wandering? They were still the chosen people of God. They still had the cloud to guide them by day and the fire to protect them at night. They still had the tabernacle. They still had the sacrifices. They still had the Mosaic law that was given to them, because God is a true friend. He is the best of friends. Therefore, even when we fall, and when we struggle with the consequences of our sins, God will still be there to protect us and provide us with mercy as His own. But now we need to spend another moment looking at those tough consequences of sin, which we see in verses 9 through 13. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done." Then Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you have in view that you have done this thing?" And Abimelech said, "Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed, she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, 'This is your kindness that you should do for me. In every place, wherever we go, say of me, he is my brother.'" These verses are just tough for me to read, because I don't know about you, I hate reading, I hate watching anytime someone else gets caught with their hand in the cookie jar. And here we have Abraham, and he is caught red-handed by Abimelech, and Abimelech lets him have it. And at the same time, it's kind of comical, because how does Abimelech let Abraham have it? He basically just asks Abraham questions and then lets Abraham dig his own grave of misery. This kind of reminds me of a parent who catches their toddler doing something wrong. Let's say they're writing with markers on the wall. You don't really need to go up to your toddler in that moment and accuse them of doing something wrong. You just need to go up to them and say, "What are you doing?" And then listen to that little kid, babble and try to excuse their way and dig a hole deeper and deeper for themselves. A few things I want to note about Abraham's response here, though. First, we see, I think, some growth from Abraham since Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 12, we don't even have Abraham expressing an interest in defending himself. But now Abraham wants to make it clear. He didn't really technically lie. She's my half-sister now. Abraham's at least concerned about his testimony, although his concern about his testimony actually just ends up sounding like a rambling kid and making things even worse. I mean, just the way it reads when he says, "She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and then she became my wife." Like he's trying to make himself look righteous when he's not. So I think we see some growth of wanting to have a good testimony before God as his prophet, but it doesn't really help him at all in this situation. But I think what really exposes Abraham and his heart and what he was thinking in this situation is when he explains why he lied in verse 13. He talks about his strategy. Now, our English Bibles say, "And it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house." And I don't think that's a very good translation of what Abraham said in the Hebrew. I think it should instead be translated as, "When the gods caused me to wander." Not when God caused me to wander, but gods in plural. Why would I say that? It's because the Hebrew word for God is the word El. The plural word for gods is the word Elohim. But in Hebrew, they have a what we would call a magisterial plural, a plural ending that doesn't really mean a lot of something, but it means someone's really awesome. So when we say Elohim, most of the time in the Bible, it's God proper. But Elohim also means gods, as in the many gods of this world. And the way that you know the difference is the verb that goes along with the noun. If you have a plural subject of Elohim, it should have a singular verb if it refers to God alone. If that plural subject has a plural verb, it means the gods did something. That's how you differentiate between this magisterial plural and just an everyday plural. Every time Elohim is used in this story, other than verse 13, we have the plural subject of Elohim with a singular verb. But this is the one time we have the plural subject Elohim taking the plural verb causing. And so we have the gods are causing. And what this ends up meaning here is we have this very sad display where Abraham is excusing himself by going back to his earlier polytheistic beliefs. I think it might be something to the effect of Abraham saying, "Abimelech, I've always been this way. I've always been deceptive ever since before my God called me. Back when I worshiped many gods, I came up with this plan." And how often do we fall into the same excuse? This is how I've always been. I'm just a warrior. I can't help it. Every time I get into this situation, I just spend and spend and spend, or eat and eat and eat in order to make myself feel better. I've never been able to control my anger problem. This was how I was before I was a Christian, and this is how I will always be, which is just a sorry excuse for our sin. Abraham here had the protections and the promises and the mercies of God at his fingertips. He could have called upon God at prayer at any moment. He could have steered clear of the region of Gerar if it was that big of a temptation to him. But he refused all the forms of grace that were available to him and instead fell back into his old sin habits. And in turn, Abraham was seen in this moment as a childish liar who was being rebuked by a pagan king, which resulted in his wife Sarah being rebuked along with him. In verse 16, Abimelech is going to speak of giving his wealth not to Sarah's husband, but to her brother. And the end of that verse tells us this was a rebuke to Sarah. Basically, Abimelech was publicly mocking her for her role in this deceit of referring to Abraham as her brother. Try as you might to avoid it, to cover it up, and to reason it away. Sin will always bring shame to the follower of God. It always harms us and anyone else who is involved in our lives. Thankfully, God is a good friend to protect us and provide us mercy in our shame. But the one thing this passage makes certain, the sting of sin is unavoidable in this life. And even with the sting of sin, though, our story ends on a wonderfully positive note by reminding us of the goodness of prayer even when we fail. Look now at verses 14 through 18. Then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham. And he restored Sarah, his wife. And Abimelech said, "See, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." Then to Sarah he said, "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who are with you and before everybody." Thus she was rebuked. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children. For the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. We are told here that one result of the deceit of Abraham and Sarah and her entrance into the household of Abimelech is that all the wombs of the household had been closed. I think this is probably the most difficult interpretation issue in this chapter, if not in the entire narrative of Abraham. I say that because at the beginning of this chapter, God comes to Abimelech in a dream, protecting Abimelech's innocence. And based on the language that is used here throughout the Old Testament, Abimelech and Sarah were clearly prevented from sleeping together. So this means she could only have been in his home for a short period of time, maybe a few days, in order for a ceremony to take place that would bring the two of them together as husband and wife. I think surely not long enough that you would notice that the women in his household could no longer bear children. I think the best explanation of this passage is that the Lord closed the wombs of the women by making the men impotent. The men were unable to finish the job, so to speak, in order to allow their wives to become pregnant and thereby closing their wombs. I don't think this is the best of explanations because the text also says God healed Abimelech and his wife and his female servant, so it seems like whatever happened to them affected both parties. But we just got to be honest, we're doing our best because we don't given all of the details in this story. The key, though, for us in this passage is how God healed the household of Abimelech. And God healed the household through Abraham's prayer. This is the second narrative in a row, the story of Sodom, followed by the healing of Abimelech, that concluded with an emphasis placed on God hearing and responding to the prayers of Abraham. And here's the intriguing contrast. While in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham acted, and not just he acted, but he was the ideal friend of God. We have him rushing around, excited to prepare a meal for the Lord. They're dining together. He's then conversing with God, growing in his knowledge of the character of the Lord. And then we almost have the exact opposite in the story of Abimelech. Abraham is forgetting God's promises altogether. He's speaking of the gods he knew before the blessings in Genesis 12. He is deceptive. He is cowardly. Yet how did God respond to Abraham's prayers in both stories? He remembered, and he gave Abraham his request. And while in Genesis 18 we have this beautiful image of God kind of gently pulling Abraham into prayer with kind of hints and nudges, here God is direct. Abraham will pray over you, Abimelech. Abraham is told to pray. So you want to know how God wants you to respond when you are struggling in your own sin and your own failures and your own mistakes? He wants you to pray. And I don't even think that that's strong enough. I would go as far as to say God commands us to pray. The worst thing we can do when we are beaten down by our own sins is to shrink back away from God and think, I'm unworthy to pray. God won't hear me. What's the point anyway? You know who doesn't want you to pray when you are wallowing in the shame of your own sin? Satan, your accuser. He is the one that always wants you to keep God at arm's length. See, if God wanted to in this story, he did not need to close the wombs of the women in the household of Abimelech. It would have made no difference to the outcome because God used that dream early on to stop Abimelech from sinning against Sarah. God didn't need Abraham's prayers at the end to open those wombs either. God could have seen Abimelech's obedience and then just healed his family immediately. Yet God used all of that to call Abraham back to him in the very situation where Abraham would be tempted to run away from God due to his shame and his sin. Instead, God wanted to draw Abraham back to fellowship and friendship with him. The sign of a great friend is one who will forgive you when you wrong them. One who will overlook your foibles when you step on their toes. One who will continue to love you even when you hog all the blankets or when you snore like a banshee riding a pig throughout the night. Someone who will give you grace when you are beyond the point of deserving anything from anyone. That is a true friend. Our God is a true friend, and he is in a real relationship with us. I called this sermon The Reality of Friendship because I think sometimes people treat God like he must be the worst of friends. Well, on the one hand, God will be with you if a hurricane comes into the area, or God will stand by your side if others mock you. He will never forsake you in your poverty, but if you sin against God, if you fall back into those old sin habits, if you lie like the liar that you are, if you feed on your lust, if you relish in your pride, God's going to drop you like you're the bad habit that you are. But God is the best of friends. And a real friendship means that he will forgive us when we are wrong. He will be faithful when we are faithless. God desired Abraham to pray to him, to speak with him, to have communication with him in the good times and in the bad. A growing faith and a maturing faith understands that we're in a real friendship with the Lord. That means he will forgive our wrongs and he will stick with us even when it is the very last thing we deserve. May we never forget how good a friend we have in the Lord. And may that encourage us all the more to trust in the grace and the mercy of his Son.